So, okay, let's start then. So, welcome to our review and mentoring program. So, this is basically a webinar about how to write good reviews, how to review papers. And it's basically, we start with this new series of workshops, which is called LatinX in CV. And the first edition is at CVPR this year. And this series of workshops, well, we want to have a slightly higher standard. So that means we need to train reviewers, especially in the field of computer vision, because it's become crazy in terms of the number of papers, and also this requires an increasing number of reviewers. So of course, the only way I think that is possible to actually match the growth of papers versus the growth of reviewers is by training new reviewers. So this is one of the ideas that we have with this program. So as you might know, this workshop is a bit different because it has two tracks. It has the extended abstract track and the full paper or novel research track. So in extended abstracts, you can submit previously published research up to 3 pages plus references plus supplementary material, and it's not published in any kind of proceedings. So this is like the standard paper format that we were using for previous workshops, usually a Neoris and ICML, right? And the full paper track is kind of new because here you should submit only novel research that is not published anywhere, of course not including archives, and it should also not be under review at any other conference or journal. And this format allows for 4 to 8 papers, 4 to 8 pages, plus references and plus supplementary material. And this will be published as a part of the CVPR workshop proceedings, which will be official workshop proceedings for our workshop. So these two tracks, which different compared to standard LatinX workshop, review and standards require a better trained program committee. And this is where the monitoring program comes. And the schedule for this workshop is that the deadline for full papers is on March 14th, so it's a bit less than 1 week from now. At the end of March, we will have the deadline for extended abstract, so we don't have to have the same deadline for both tracks. At the beginning of April, we will have the deadline of reviews. So the review process for full papers is around 2 to 3 weeks, while for extended abstract is a bit less. And we will have the decisions by the first week of April. And then by mid of April, to be defined, we will have the camera-ready versions for all the papers and all the abstracts. And this is to be defined because the CVPR workshop chairs have to tell us when exactly is this deadline, and they also don't know exactly when it will be. And the workshop will happen on June 19th of this year. So the objectives of the mentoring program for reviewers, it's separate from the standard mentoring program. So this is completely running only for this review period. And the objective is to aim to help junior reviewers to become proficient reviewers. So to build the reviewing community and expand the reviewing pool. And so we categorize all the members that apply to the program committee as junior reviewers, intermediate reviewers, or senior reviewers, depending on how much experience they have writing papers and reviewing papers. So that's why we ask things like how much experience do you have reviewing for like top level computer vision conferences? What is your complete reviewing experience and your Google Scholar or list of publications? So the idea is that a junior reviewer is reviews papers under the supervision of a senior reviewer. So the senior reviewer should tell you and guide you, for example, how to write a good review. And it will include many of the tips that we include in this presentation. And one important thing that why also we do this is that the knowledge of how papers are reviewed, like if you can write a good review, it's very likely that you can also write very good papers, because if you know how the papers are going to be judged and what the reviewers will look at your papers, then of course it's much easier for you to write a strong paper. And this is also a way to strengthen the papers that are coming from Latin America. So it's very positive for us as program committee chairs and for you as a future paper writing person. And of course, why do we need a review mentoring program? I mentioned at the beginning that CVPR has a much higher reviewing standard. And this is the first time that our workshop will have a kind of official proceedings as part of CVPRW. And we want to be inclusive and include as most people as possible in the program committee. We don't want to exclude anyone, but of course we recognize that some people may need help into reviewing papers. So many people learn how to write reviews during a PhD program. What happens usually is that you're a PhD student under a supervisor, usually a professor, of course, and sometimes the professor gets a review request and gives them to you, and then you basically help your supervisor to review papers. So it's very similar to this mentoring program, but it happens usually during a PhD program. But of course, you can also learn this outside of a formal PhD program through mentorship. So this is one reason that we decided to include this mentoring program in this context. And I mentioned before that knowing how papers are reviewed and what the reviewers look for is very powerful to write your own papers in the future. Now, why do we review papers? Well, basically because peer review and the whole reviewing system is a system of quality control for scientific research. So we not only review papers, but also, for example, we review conference and workshop proposals, research project proposals, master and PhD thesis, etc. So all of these things are basically part of the scientific research process. So peer review is always something that you have to deal with, and the best knowledge that you have about the peer review process, the best. And here I have a citation from Nicholas and Gordon that says that the goals of peer review are very clear: to ensure the accuracy and improve the quality of the published literature through constructive criticism. And I think this short sentence is very powerful because it is short, but it tells you everything that you need to know. That the idea of peer review or paper reviewing is to improve the quality of the papers that are going to be published, and it should be through constructive criticism. It should not be destructive or negative criticism. So that's why it's also we have issues with, for example, people that write bad reviews that they don't put the time into making a good review and into trying to be constructive. So of course, this is something we'll always have to fight against. And what are peers? Because of course it's called peer review. So peers are generally defined as researchers publishing in the same or similar topics that the paper under review. So other PhD students, professors, postdocs, and everyone in the academic pipeline, and also outside of the academic institutions like industry. So this means also that in order to be a peer reviewer, one needs to be familiar with the literature, and of course, publishing papers in a field is kind of a proxy for this. If you're able to get your papers published, then of course you can also review papers in the same topic. And this also tells you that you need to be familiar with a certain topic, like in terms of literature and kind of methods that they use in this field. Because, for example, if you are a theoretical person, a person that does theoretical research, of course you cannot, or you will have trouble reviewing papers that are more applied, and vice versa. So, of course, there has to be a match between the reviewer expertise and the paper that is under review. And now the slide about peer review is that the process where your peers review your publication, they make comments, they suggest corrections, they evaluate novelty and scientific relevance, and make recommendations to the editor or to the program committee chair. So as I mentioned, the reviewers are usually professors, established researchers in the academic industry, PhD students. Usually you don't see much people that are under these levels, like master students can be reviewers depending on specific cases, and usually not undergraduate students. So at least I think the minimum kind of barrier is to have an undergraduate review, because you need to have a minimum qualification to make a review. But of course, this varies because you may have only an undergraduate degree, but you have a lot of professional experience, or you have many publications, or you just have reviewed for a very long time. That also counts into what counts for future reviewing experience. And also, reviewing is very similar between journal and conferences, but of course, there are slight differences. Like in journals, you can have multiple review cycles. You can submit a paper, then get it rejected, and then the editor tells you to resubmit with some changes, and then the whole process starts again until the paper is accepted or is finally rejected without any problem. What conferences usually they only have one review cycle, and like most of the top conferences, like in computer vision and machine learning, also they have a rebuttal period where you can respond to the reviews. But it's kind of still a one cycle review process. And also we need to consider that the review process is also sometimes a bit random. there are contradictory reviews, and the aims of us, of the PC co-chairs, is to aim to reduce the randomness and try to see patterns in the reviews. Like, so what is your job as a reviewer? So it's actually very simple. So you can summarize them with these 4 points. The first is to advise the PC co-chairs, that means us, on which papers to accept, using your experience and your scientific skills. And of course, assuming that you have some background on the topics of the paper that is under review. So you should always accept to review a paper if you have the expertise, or you know that you have the background, or it's in a similar topic to the paper, to the literature that you usually use, or the topics you usually research about. So if you get assigned a paper that you cannot review, you can tell us and we can change the assignment. And the second point is to make sure that the authors understand your opinion and why is it fundamented, or why did you make that opinion. So you should always justify your recommendation and support it with evidence. So you not just say, yeah, this is your opinion, but you should also say why. For example, the typical case is that people say, oh, this paper is very similar to another paper that is already published. But of course, if you don't mention you don't provide a reference, then it's very hard to justify this opinion. And you should also always help the authors to improve their paper with justified recommendations. So the idea is that the idea of reviewing papers is not that the papers should be rejected or accepted, but also that it should be improved. Even if a paper you think is going to be accepted because you see it's a very strong contribution to the state of the art, in any case, it can always be improved. That doesn't mean, of course, that you need to find reasons to improve it, but you should make sure that everything is there. And we're going to mention kind of things that you should take into consideration. You should also treat everyone fairly and uniformly. Like, you should write reviews that you would like to receive. If you write, for example, bad reviews, then of course you would not like to write a paper and then get a bad review to your own paper. And you should apply the reviewing standards and guidelines uniformly. That means to have the same bar for every paper. And finally, you need to also behave ethically and expect others to do the same. And this means, well, multiple things, but mainly it means to prevent conflicts of interest. So the first thing we need to define is what is a good or accepted paper. So what do we look for in a paper that should be accepted? So specific to this workshop is that the topic is of interest for the LatinX in AI and LatinX in CV community. So of course, it's not just the topic, but the core contribution of the paper. So this gives a broad definition of what is a good paper. So the contribution of the paper should be very, very clear. So this is something that always put a lot of emphasis, that sometimes people may have a good contribution, but they didn't write what is their contribution in the paper. So it's your job as a reviewer to make sure that the authors write this. And you should also consider that all papers should be well motivated. It's like you say, okay, I create a new technique to solve some problem, but of course you need to have a good motivation for the problem before trying to solve it, right? The second point is that it meets community standards of correctness and significance, meaning that the paper is correct, like that you can follow the logic of how the authors took all their decisions, and also basically that there are no mistakes, like obvious mistakes, of course. And significance means that it does not immediately mean that it beats a particular set of the art. Like, it's not just comparing numbers, but it should be a much more broad criteria of evaluation, not just based on just one metric. So of course, significance is more of a judgment, and for this you need to know the state of the art that is related to the paper under review. And finally, the paper has to be scientifically sound. So it should not have mistakes in evaluation. Like, if you repeat all the experiments, you should get the same results, not exactly the same results, but you should get the same conclusion. For example, you say, okay, method A is better than method B. You should have enough evidence to conclude the same as the others are concluding. So, and also the paper should be understandable to the reader. So it should be easy to read. If there are things that are not clear when reading, you should definitely flag this and tell the authors in your review. And all the logical arguments in the paper body should be sound, like, for example, proof, motivation, experiments, etc. So this tells you all the three things that you need to find or to use as a matter to decide what is a good or an accepted paper. So how do we usually do it, review process? Like, this is a personal thing, of course, because everyone reviews paper differently. So the way I do it, usually I just read the paper completely first, and I usually print the paper so I can make annotations in the paper body. But of course, you can use a tablet or any other digital means to make annotations in the paper. And while I'm reading the paper, I follow all the arguments and annotate any kind of issues I find immediately in the paper body. And then when I do this in the whole paper, I usually reread, but only focus in key areas of the paper. For example, I try to find what are the contributions, what is the description of the technique, and if I understand what the authors are describing, the experimental setup and the results, and the conclusions. So these are usually the most important parts of the paper. And then I usually concentrate and try to read and understand this completely. So in any case, you can also refer to the literature if the paper requires it. For example, if you're reviewing a paper that, for example, is incremental improvements over another paper, and maybe you have not read this paper before, but you can also take the chance to read it now and then compare with the paper that you're on the review you're reviewing. And as step 4, I review the claims that are made by the authors and check if they're correct, if they're supported by the evidence, like results. Like, for example, the authors say, okay, technique A is better than B, but it's not better than C. Then, of course, I check the results and if I conclude the same, or if there's some contradictions or something like that, because it's usually typical that some authors, of course, try to oversell the results, like they claim that the technique is the best in the world, and maybe the results don't really cite it. So all of these kind of small things should be mentioned in the review. And also, if the paper has supplementary material, I also look at the supplementary material, especially at points where the paper mentions that supplementary material. And finally, after doing all of this, I write my review. And of course, we're going to give you some insights about how to write reviews. So this is a flowchart that I got from the paper Nicholas and Gordon that the reference is at the end of the presentation. So it's basically the same procedure that I just mentioned. That first, but it's more broad because it includes, for example, first you're invited to review. You evaluate if you have the appropriate expertise. If you have the appropriate expertise, then of course, if there's no conflict of interest, then you can accept the review. If you don't have the appropriate expertise, and if there's a conflict of interest, for example, if you know the authors, or if the authors of the paper that they are inviting you to review are your collaborators, then you should of course decline to review because that's a conflict of interest. Or if you want to review it for your supervisor and so on. So any kind of where do you feel that people may complain that you are reviewing a paper because you have some relationship to the authors of the paper on the review, then you should definitely decline to review. And usually when you decline, you can also suggest other people that you may think that are good reviewers for this paper. Once you accept the review, you should, of course, first read the whole paper. Well, the text author will tell you to write the first 2 paragraphs of the review, like the summary and the contribution. Then you have 3 different kind of branches. One is if you think the paper is publishable in principle. The second is if there are major flaws that can be addressed, or if the paper is fatally flawed. So of course, this corresponds if the paper should be accepted, if it should be accepted, but after only some changes, or if it should be rejected. So in any case, you basically, if it's publishable, you provide a full review, then you look at the scientific details, you read the paper 2 or 3 times, and then you submit and write your final review. If there's a major flaw in the paper, but if you think that this flaw can be fixed by maybe additional experiments or just changing the paper, then you document and substantiate the flaws and indicate, and of course you still make a full review of the paper, but of course concentrating on this flaw, and maybe include information on how to fix the flaw. So for example, you review a paper in reinforcement learning, and it's very well known that in reinforcement learning papers, you need to make, if you make multiple comparisons, you need to have multiple runs of each RL algorithm, because of course there's a lot of randomness in reinforcement learning. So you see a paper that only has 1 trial run for each algorithm, then I would say that this is a bad methodology, but it can be fixed by having multiple runs and by making a much more scientific comparison. And if you think the paper cannot be published because it has a fatal flaw, and of course you should definitely document completely and substantiate what is the flaw, and then submit this as a review. So now we're going to talk about a bit something different, that there are a lot of different kinds of papers that you can see in in the literature. So for example, there are position papers, basically papers that put the opinion, the scientific opinion of some scientists that they say, okay, maybe this is a problem in the state of the art, and so on. There are application papers that they don't build new techniques, but they use techniques and apply them to some application. There are theory papers that they do any of these other kind of papers, but they do it from a theoretical point of view. There are also papers that are called understanding, that instead of trying to create new techniques, they try to understand why techniques work the way they work. There are also dataset papers, and this is also very valuable for the community to have a paper that describes a dataset, how it was captured, how can it be used, and what tasks is defined, and some benchmarks or to start. There are papers, of course, that define new techniques. There are papers that provide breakthroughs. For example, the Higgs boson is a very well-cited paper that is basically a breakthrough. And other breakthroughs that happen in machine learning and computer vision. There are papers that are incremental, that basically make an incremental improvement over other techniques. There are also survey papers where the idea is not to create new techniques, but to see what is available to solve a given problem. And they describe it like a piece of literature in a specific field, and also they make let's say connections to other fields or connections inside the same field. For example, they document common problems that all methods have, or problems in the data set and so on. And finally, you have also benchmark papers, which are similar to survey papers, but they usually try to benchmark like a whole set of techniques for a given problem in a single way. So of course, why do we tell you about all of these kind of papers? Is because reviewing this kind of each of the kind of papers requires a slightly different mindset. So for example, some papers like theoretical papers may not have results, but they draw conclusions from the literature. Or for example, survey papers may not have results, but they still draw conclusions and they still provide new scientific knowledge by comparing, for example, the state of the art to itself. So ideas that are breakthroughs may not have a complete set of experiments, may have a lot of toy experiments, but you might think that the idea is very interesting itself. And this happens in every conference and in every journal. Incremental papers, for example, must be correctly evaluated to assess progress. Like if there's a standard evaluation protocol for a given task, like for example, certain data sets or certain way to evaluate, then you should make sure as a reviewer to check that this protocol is followed and the results make sense. So what's important is that each paper has like a different way to be evaluated and to be reviewed. And of course, the first step would be to find what kind of paper is the paper that you're going to review. And related to this, we have something called the 7 Ws. So this is kind of a set of questions that I initially encountered during my master's program many years ago, and they're very useful to also to write papers, but also to review papers. So I'm going to describe them here in the coming slides. So the first one, W, is what is the problem? So if you review a paper, you should first, of course, try to find out what is the problem that they're trying to solve, and what is its content. And the second W is why is this problem important? So of course, the problem should be described. Why is it important, and to who is important? And the third W is what other people have done about the problem. So this is the state of the art. So usually people write kind of a conceptual framework to categorize previous research type. They divide the state of the art into different parts that and categorize. And usually this is a short section in the paper, but still very, very important to make sure that the authors are aware of the literature that related to the problem. The next W is why is this not sufficient? So usually as part of the introduction or at the end of the related work, people describe why the problem they think is not solved completely. And this is a key part of building your motivation and your contribution to the state of the art. So of course, there could be many deficits in the state of the art, and people may only describe the ones that are relevant to their paper. And next, then once you have set why a problem, how people usually solve it, and why is it not really useful for, or is it not sufficient to solve the problem, then you need to propose something to do something differently, right? And this is kind of the main content of the paper, which describes the proposed technique, the theoretical framework, or the research idea and the concept. And then, of course, the next question is why is it better? How do you know that this is better than the previous solution? and it is corresponds to the experimental setup and the evaluation section of the paper. And of course, it contains the main body of results, and the authors argue why the proposed technique is better. And the final W is like what is left to be done after going to the problem, this is the art, a new technique or a new insights. What is left to be done, and this usually corresponds to the analysis of the results, like where you can find the advantages and the disadvantages of the technique proposed in the paper, and the conclusion of the future work section. And as you see, all of these steps or questions should be present in some way in the paper. So this is, I think, the best way to write a paper, and this applies to pretty much any topic. So it's a very good reference for both writing and reviewing a paper. So while you are reviewing a paper, you should try to remember these questions and then try to find, for example, if any of these are missing, because this may indicate, for example, a flaw in the writing of the paper. So as I mentioned here, after reading the paper, the reviewer should be able to answer these questions to a degree, and anything that is missing should be can be a possible issue. So what usually you should consider or look for in papers that you are reviewing. So there's some kind of standard errors that everyone makes at some point, and we put them here in order of importance. So in machine learning, at least in computer vision, I would say the most important thing is people sometimes put or leave details out about reproducibility. So for example, everything that you need to know about how to reproduce the results in the paper. Usually, what kind of neural network architecture they were using, what optimizer, what hyperparameters of the method are we using, which datasets. And actually, I reviewed papers where the people didn't mention which dataset they were using. They just present the results without mentioning which dataset. And of course, this is not really possible to reproduce and not really possible to interpret. So of course, this was my first complaint, that how can you write a paper when you don't mention which dataset was used? So I think the second point is grammar and clean writing. So the paper should be easy to read. And if it's very easy, hard to read, that's usually something to mention in the review, especially if the paper, like if the writing is like very convoluted, because sometimes since you have only partial space in the paper, you cannot write an infinite paper or a paper with 90 pages, something like that. Sometimes if you write things in a very convoluted way, it usually takes more space than writing it concisely and easily. So this also helps to free up space to put other results and other things in the paper. So the third thing is to find plots that have no explanations. Like for example, there's no caption, there's no axis labels, or there are no legends. And this also happens a lot, that people in the heat of writing the paper, they forget to put some axis labels or some legends. And of course, if there are no axis labels, then it's very difficult to explain or to interpret what the plot is saying. So this happens always, that sometimes people forget this. Continuing, if there are missing references to the literature, if you think that the paper, for example, is very similar to another paper, or maybe the paper will benefit by citing some other papers, then you should definitely mention this in your review. But of course, it should not be just a way to that you are basically proposing to cite your own papers. It should be something very well fundamental. Also, there could be unclear explanation of concepts. So usually concepts in a paper are very important, because this is basically the way that you convince other people about how your things work. And if it's unclear how this is explained, then you should definitely let the authors know. Also, if there are figures that are not referenced in text. So usually if you put a figure, it's because somewhere in the text, you use this figure to advance your argument, correct? So of course, sometimes figures are missing like the figure is not missing, but the reference to the figure somewhere in the text is missing. And this indicates that maybe there's a problem. Also, if the contributions are unclear or they're missing. So if they're unclear, so of course, this should be clarified. But what can also happen is that the authors may have missed some contributions that you think the paper maybe is much stronger than the authors realize, or that there are some contributions that the authors didn't consider and that they should definitely include in their paper. And this has happened it happened a few years ago, that Ian Goodfellow was looking at open review papers, and he found a paper about GANs that actually was training a GAN in all the ImageNet classes, and no other paper had done this. And he wrote like a comment saying, "Oh, dear authors, you have actually one big contribution, which is that you can actually now train a GAN in the whole ImageNet dataset, which was not possible before." So of course, this is a very positive review that the authors maybe didn't consider this. And finally, one thing that you should also always take a look is find typos in writing. So this always happens that even in your magnum opus of writing, you will always have some kind of typo because writing in a computer is not trivial. So you can always tell the authors, for example, if they write some words incorrectly and so on. And also important what to report to the PC chairs. So of course, there are some things that are very negative. So and you should let us know. So in case that we need to, for example, maybe desk-read a paper or take some action. So for the first one is violation of the double-blind policy. So all the papers that are submitted to our workshop in both tracks should be double-blind, meaning that the paper should be anonymized. It should not have the names of the authors anywhere or the institutions, and also the reviewers are anonymous to the authors. So of course, if you see a paper where the authors are mentioning who they are, then you should let us know so we can reject this paper. Also, if there are double or concurrent submissions with another conference that has proceedings. So this only applies to the full paper track. But if we have a paper that is in the full paper track under review, this paper should not be also submitted or even published in another conference or another journal that has proceedings, because people really don't like this because it's basically a waste of resources, because reviewing time is very valuable. And of course, if you submit to two conferences, that means that you're using 2 times the normal review time that you would normally be using. So if, for example, this happens that if you're a reviewer for another conference and you see the same paper, because it's very likely that if you have the expertise to review a paper, it is independent of the conference of the workshop where you're reviewing. So it happens that sometimes authors submit a paper to two conferences, and the reviewers and the chairs of the conference, they realize, because one of the reviewers told them that they're also reviewing another conference and they also saw the same paper. So this is not allowed. You should let us know to contact the authors and also to demonstrate this paper. And finally, you should also flag research that is potentially unethical, that maybe we don't want to review because it's too unethical. So for example, this is very hard to define. So of course you should let us know if you think that this can be problematic. So one case is research that needs approval from an IRB. So for example, if it involves research on humans, then of course we should definitely, usually the paper has information about the IRB, but if it doesn't have any information, that this could be a problem. And also pseudoscience. I mean, I call it pseudoscience. For example, there are papers that identify criminals or sexual orientation from facial images, which is actually impossible. So these kind of papers are really not really useful to review, because you know that the paper basically has a flaw in its conception. So maybe it's better to let us know, and that we can talk to the authors and tell them why we're not going to review this paper. An important thing that this case of machine learning for identifying criminals or sexual orientation actually has happened. You can find the papers in archives, and you can find these were very controversial papers some time ago, and people found out that in the end, the method doesn't really learn to identify criminals, but only to identify biases in the data set, and the same for sexual orientation. So these kind of papers, like the core idea itself, is not good, so I would unethical, so I would not like to read this kind of papers. So also we tell you another kind of rubric that is used to evaluate a paper, and it's called the 5 Cs. So it's very similar to the 7 Ws, but of course it's different. So one is the category. What kind of paper is this? So once you know which kind of paper it is, you can set your mindset to evaluate, to use a different kind of standard to evaluate the paper. And then the context, what other papers are related to this one, and does it build on other people's contribution? So of course, any paper should have a state of the art section and be related to other papers. And then the correctness, are the assumptions valid, and if there are mistakes in the paper? So this is your job as a reviewer to try to find if the assumptions are valid and if there are mistakes. And of course, any reviewer cannot catch all the possible mistakes that are in the paper. So you can only review what is in the paper itself. And then the contributions, what are the contributions of this paper to the state of the art? So this should be very clear either by your review, or it should be very clear from the text of the paper. And finally, the clarity. If the paper is easy to read, if the writing can be improved, and if their plots, formulas, or diagrams are readable and are explainable, like people can understand the idea from the plot, the formula, or the diagram. Now, how to make decisions. So this is also a bit difficult because it's basically an opinion. So each reviewer may have its own opinion. So usually we use a scale of five levels, starting on strong accept and going until strong reject. So of course you have all the intermediate steps like borderline, like the paper is right on the admission or acceptance criteria. A quick accept if it's a bit above the borderline, weak reject if it's a bit below the borderline, and strong reject. So here we provide kind of a small summary of how to make this decision. So a strong accept should be a paper that has no little or no flaws, and a clear contribution. And then of course it goes down because you need to basically weight the flaws of the paper, like what is the negatives with the positives, with the merits. So if the paper merits outweigh the flaws, but only slightly, then you can have a weak accept. If the paper has an equal number of flaws and merits, then it's borderline. If it has more flaws than merits, it's kind of a weak reject. And if the paper has wrong results or no results, or is not evaluated correctly, it should be a strong reject. No results means that the idea has already been published before. And of course, in any case, that if you issue a strong reject decision, you should definitely let the authors know why. So you should always document the reasons and the logic that led to this decision, and always how the paper can be improved in order to improve your decision. And now how to write your review. So of course, this is also kind of a personal style. So there are many ways to write these reviews. So this is the way I use, because it matches the reviewing forms that are used by many workshops. So the first is the first paragraph is to summarize the paper, what the paper is about. So what is the problem, why is it important, and what is proposed to be done differently. So of course, this, if you see it, is some of the 7 Ws. Then you should summarize the paper's contribution in a few words. Then write all the strengths and all the weaknesses, and then note them very clearly. Like you write a section that says, okay, these are the strengths, these are the weaknesses. Like, okay, the strengths are the idea is very nice, or it works very well, and the weakness is okay, it works very well, but the results are not very strong because of reproducibility, for example. Then you summarize, you make your decision based on the previous slide, and then you summarize this decision and the logic and the reasons that led to this decision. And then at the end, you write all the minor points, like for example, typos, writing issues, plots that are missing experiments that you suggest that be fit in the next revision. And I think that this all of these parts, they match many of the review forms that are used by workshops. And here is the review form that we actually use for this workshop. So it's mostly the same for both tracks, so there's only differences in one of the questions. So the first point is, in 3 or 5 sentences, describe the key ideas, experiments that are significant. So this is the first part of the previous slide. Then you describe the strengths and the weaknesses of the paper, and of course you should clearly explain why these aspects of the paper are valuable, and which aspects and why are weak. And of course, make comments very based on facts, like citations, if you feel that the ideas are not novel, or if the paper should improve, if you add some citations, like if it connects to other papers or to other fields. Then you provide an overall paper rating, and here are the 5 choices. Then you explain how the strengths and the weaknesses are weighted for the rating. Then at the end, you provide additional comments related to the paper, so typos and any other minor issues that you think that should be fixed. And then at the end, you provide a reviewer's confidence in the recommendation. So this VC means very, very confident and not confident. So this also weighs in your expertise. So if you're very expert in the field of the paper, then you should say very confident. If you are not an expert, but you have a lot of knowledge in the field, then maybe you put confident. And if you are basically guessing, then you put not confident. And this is used by the TPC co-chairs to weight also your opinion. So here we have some examples that I took from ICLR. So in the ICLR reviewing guidelines, they provide two example reviews. One is accept and one is reject, and we can go through them here. So we don't have to read them, each of them letter by letter, but I put some underlines here about what is important from this review. So as you see, the review starts with a summary. Then it has some reasons for a score, and the score, of course, is somewhere in the reviewing process. They mentioned, for example, what is the major concern of the paper. Here is about the clarity of the paper and some ablations. In goes to the pros, which are the strengths. So it says, okay, it consists of an issue of metal learning, which is the most important, that's heterogeneity. It provides comprehensive experiments, qualitative analysis, and quantitative analysis results. And in the cons, they just mentioned that the only negative things is that there are some missing ablation studies, meaning that some variations of the algorithms of the experiments in order to make comparisons. So they also mentioned in point 2 here that for the autoencoder, they should provide more details because this is related to reproducibility. And in point 3 in the cons, they mentioned it will be more convincing if the authors do this. So basically, they're helping the authors to, so if you do this, maybe you have more chance of convincing people that your technique is better. And at the end, you have here some type. So of course, we're going to make the slides available so you can see all the review in detail. And now this is a review about a paper that is rejected. So again, you see at the beginning, you have kind of a general statement about the paper. Then you have these positives. So to say, okay, one positive is the paper is very well written. But you see, okay, the positives are 3 or 4 sentences, but the negatives, the concerns or the negative parts of the weaknesses, is a much longer part and actually spans almost 2 pages or 2 slides. So the key concern about this paper is the lack of rigorous experimentation. So to say, considering the limited results, a deeper analysis of the proposed method would have been nice. Here they mention a claim of 20 point. Sorry. There's a 20% reduction in some test error, but this has not been clearly addressed. Like they don't mention why this happened, or if it's just a stochastic error, or if it's really because the method is actually better. Also, they mentioned that in figure 4, why there's some chart dips, so there's some strange pattern in the results that maybe indicates a problem. And in the next point, they mentioned that the results are not conclusively in favor of the proposed method. So maybe the authors say that the method is better, but the results don't actually match with it. So of course, this is very bad for like you should never try to deceive the reader and the reviewer, because the reviewers will definitely catch this mistake. So they also suggest that the proposed method would have been much better if it was analyzed in the context of a simple machine learning problem. So for example, logistic regression. So sometimes these toy problems are very important for the reviewers because it's much easier to understand how the technique is actually working. And so also some minor comments that actually like some of the typos, some notation, mathematical notation, and some misspelled words. And one thing that you immediately know is that the reject review is much longer than the accept review, because of course there are more negative things and this takes more text to describe. Now we come to the end of this presentation. So we are now describe about the ethics of peer review. So the first thing is about conflict of interest. So the idea is that the reviews should be impartial. I should not have no conflict of interest with the authors or to review a paper. So for example, you have a conflict of interest if you work at the same institution as the author. So it's very likely that you know this person. And of course, the conflict of interest is that this person, if they know that you are the reviewer, then they can try to blackmail you or something like that. If you have direct involvement in the work, for example, if you were advisor to a thesis that is related to the paper, or you receive credit in the paper from any way, of course you should not be a reviewer. And if you suspect that others may perceive a conflict of interest in your involvement, you should also not decline to review. And if you have collaborated with one of the authors in the past 3 years, so of course this threshold, it varies. Like maybe 3 years is a long time, maybe 1 year is enough. So it's a bit blurry. So so of course, if you are one of the collaborators of one of the authors, then you should let the PC chairs know, and they will decide if you have a conflict of interest or not. So usually collaboration is defined by having written a paper together or a grant proposal. So about professionalism too, so it's also very important that you as a reviewer should be professional during the whole process. There is no place for belittling or inappropriate comments about the paper. And this happens always. Like, I'm not sure if it happens in our workshop, but I've seen it in other conferences, that people make sarcastic comments, belittling, sexist or racist comments. And this is not good. So the most valuable comments in a review are always the ones that help the author understand the shortcomings of their work and how they might improve it. So of course, if you are being sarcastic or sexist or racist, of course, none of that matters because people will actually not really like your review because you were using this bad word. So you should always write a courteous, informative, incisive, and helpful review that you will be proud to sign with your name. So for example, you should always consider that would you like the review if it was not anonymous, so people know that you wrote this review. If you don't like because you're maybe using not so nice words, then maybe you should reconsider the words you're using. So any paper can have flaws. Of course, you should point the flaws professionally. If the idea or very similar ideas has been previously published, you should definitely include references to the work, so people can actually, like the author should evaluate if it's really similar or not, or if there's still something that can be rescued from the paper. One important thing is that if you don't follow these guidelines, it can mean a permanent ban for future program committees. Like people can complain about your review, and if we see that you didn't follow these professionalism guidelines, then of course maybe you will not be a reviewer for a workshop in the future. So we will definitely remember and pass this information to the future if this happens. Now here we provide a short some reviewing guidelines, because a lot of conferences also provide reviewing guidelines that are very useful to especially the ICLR 21 reviewing guidelines, from where we got some sample reviews. So they always have very good tips about how to review papers. So we will have our own reviewing guidelines, but they're not completely ready now, so they will be ready during this week. And one paper I would like to, well, there's also this CVPR 2020 tutorial on how to write a good review. So it's like an 8-hour tutorial by multiple people about how to write good reviews. So it's also a very good reading if you want to be a reviewer. And this paper here by Nicholas and Gordon. It's from the geophysical field, but it's only a 3-page paper that describes how to write solid reviews, and it's actually very, very nice in terms of what kind of insights and guidelines they use. So I definitely recommend this that you read this paper if you're interested in reviewing papers. So now here we come to the end of the webinar. So of course now we would like to take your questions, and here we provide our contact details for the PC co-chairs individually, or for the overall CVPR 2021 LatinX chair. So that's it from my side. So please, any questions that you have, I can take them now.
Just as a reminder, you can feel free to unmute yourself or put a question in the chat, and we can read it as well to Matias.
Yes, please.
So Matias, a quick question. This is just in general. No one has particularly asked this, but what if the paper that you are reviewing feels a little out of depth from your understanding? I'm not sure if you covered this already in your presentation. How could you go about confidently writing a review if it's something that you don't have as much specialization or background in? Would you need to report that to the PC chairs, or could you still submit a review on that particular subject?
So I think that depends, of course, because, for example, I don't have much knowledge, for example, in general machine learning, but you can still review a paper if you think that you can still do a good job. But of course, this is kind of a self-evaluation. So if you think that you don't have the expertise to review a paper, then you should definitely let the PC chairs know, so they can change the reviewers for this paper. So it's always complicated to evaluate this, because maybe you think that you can actually do it, but maybe while you're reading the paper, you actually say, no, actually I cannot do it. So if you find at any point that you think that you cannot review a paper, you should definitely let us know as soon as possible, so we can actually fix this and maybe assign another paper to you or assign another reviewer to this paper. But it's difficult to say, because like machine learning is also very general. So for example, even if you have not worked in applications, you can still review a paper from your general machine learning knowledge. So that's something that each reviewer has to evaluate on its own to decide if they can actually review this paper or if it's maybe too outside of their usually expertise in order to review. So yeah, it's basically a self-evaluation. And the same thing because in CMT, we ask all the reviewers to provide primary and secondary topic areas. And of course, it's also self-evaluated. We're not validating this in any way. So we trust that the reviewers will be able to tell us like what are their expertise and how it fits into the workshop.
Thank you. So it looks like Sweta has another question in this area. In which scenario would a reviewer choose NC or not confident as a confidence rating if the reviewer is familiar with the field and problem?
That's a great question. So the thing is that you may be familiar with the field of the problem, but like the problem itself, but maybe you're not confident about the solution. So for example, this happens, I'm not sure if you have read the paper about neural ordinary differential equations, neural ODEs. So in order to review this paper, you need to have like a general machine learning knowledge and a general neural network knowledge. And also you need to be maybe very specialist into differential equations. So of course, for example, maybe not a single reviewer has all of this knowledge. So this knowledge maybe is spread around different reviewers. So maybe one reviewer says, okay, I will review the theoretical differential equation part. Another reviewer will review the experiments and review like the general machine learning part. Another reviewer will review another part. So for example, in this case, a reviewer may say, okay, I reviewed this part of the paper, but I couldn't review the whole paper. And they may put, for example, if they're not confident in their own review. So of course, this happens a lot because many fields intersect a lot. Like for example, fairness intersects with social sciences, with machine learning, with computer science and computer vision. So of course, maybe you can only review parts of the paper, but not the whole paper. Maybe you can review, for example, the theoretical side, but not the experiment. So of course, in this case, you can signal this by writing in the review that you can only review this part, but not this other part. And you can also signal it by saying, okay, I'm not really confident on my review overall because you cannot review the whole paper.
Yeah, there is another question.
Yes.
From CJ.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is a good rule of thumb or the viewpoint for reviewing the standard abstracts, given the 2-page limit? For example, one figure or table, given the work is more empirical compared to theoretical work?
So do you want to answer that, Victor?
Yeah, so well, so for the standard abstracts, one thing that I mean, like we have to keep in mind is that there are three different tracks or kind of standard abstracts that we will expect in the workshop. One is that there are probably already this is already published work. So in that sense, this standard abstract might point you to the full paper in the supplementals. So in that case, basically what you will review in that kind of scenarios is that the paper follow with the guidelines and that introduce or summarize the idea of this of the other paper for this conference. Yeah. The other scenario is that this might be like application papers. So this might be, for example, given that the workshop is focused on the Latin community, this might be, for example, for example, taking an existing technique, for example, faster RCNN, or segmentation models, image segmentation models applied to the context of, for example, autonomous driving, let's say in Latin America. So there might be so the focus might not be on the algorithm side, but it might be on the application, like for example, exploring like these kind of solutions for the context of Latin America. So in those cases, what we would like is that your feedback in terms of like, oh, like for example, pertinence of this, like pertinence of the problem, that the problem is described in a correct manner, and so on and so forth. So I mean, your review will will focus more on like, I mean, how to advance this kind of like application for further, and if it's correctly posed, and so on and so forth. And the third track is like, it could be a position paper. So for position papers, like I think that I mean you should be flexible in that in some regards, given that I mean it's work in progress. So basically, like try to give the better feedback. Like for example, try to detect early on, like, oh, maybe the I mean like the submission itself is like, oh, I'm trying to see like if this is a good idea to continue further. Yeah. So review the contributions, or like the initial contributions, but mainly focus on, like for example, helping the submission to tweak, to steer the direction of the research. Yeah. So that's why, like for example, you might be able to find like one figure, one table, and you could you could tell it like, oh, like, you know, like based on the initial results that you have, one possible direction is this one. The contributions, in the sense like the algorithm that you describe, technically sound. So yes, like for example, that this position paper is valuable for the workshop. Yeah. So that's how kind of like in a really briefly manner we see this kind of extended abstracts going.
Yeah, great. So also I would like to mention that the extended access can be up to 3 pages, plus references, plus supplementary material. So if you have results that don't fit into these 3 pages, you can always put them into supplementary material, and the reviewer should consider them as well. And also, many of the extended abstracts are usually work in progress. So as Victor mentioned, you should try to evaluate these papers a bit differently. So you should try to find out if the problem is well defined, if the solution makes sense, and if there's a contribution in there. Like, it doesn't have to be like a complete evaluation of the contribution, but it should have some signs that this is going into the right direction. So of course, because since it's work in progress, maybe you don't have the full picture, but still can be interesting for the community to know about this direction. So it's also, the workshop is not only to present like complete full research, but also to know what other people are working on and how can they connect to other people, like to do networking based on what they're working on. So you have any more questions?
Laura, the recording will be available right after, I mean, like soonish.
Yes, we can publish this recording, and then also if Matias would like to share his slides, we can publicize those as well.
Yes, I understand as well.
Yeah.
So maybe now I can also talk a bit about what are the next steps. So if you see here the schedule, so I forgot to put the schedule actually for the mentoring program. So what will happen is that during this week, we will be assigning senior reviewers to the junior reviewers. And you will get an email from us, like making a match. And then you can start contacting your senior reviewer. And then at the end of, at the beginning of next week, we will already have all the full papers. And then we will start to assign reviewers for these papers. And then you may get an assignment through your senior reviewer to review a specific paper. So then the senior reviewer will actually add you to CMT as an external reviewer, and then you can start working on the review. And then you should definitely discuss with your senior reviewer. For example, if you have questions about the paper, you can maybe write an initial version of your review and submit it to your senior reviewer so he can get comments and so on. So it's a very free process. So the idea is that the same as you are writing reviews for a paper, the idea is that you also improve in the way that you write reviews. And of course that you also get experience writing reviews, because some of the people that we found in the PC would have literally zero experience reviewing papers. So of course, then it's very valuable for them to be able to review papers with the help of a senior reviewer. So do you have any questions about the mentoring program in general, not specifically how to review papers? We can also take this question now.
Here's another general question, Matias. What are the benefits of participating in program committees and reviewing papers? Is this something that a researcher could include on their CV? Is it something that may benefit them in their future, trying to further their career in the space?
Yes, definitely. So yeah, great that you asked this. So being in the program committee is something that you can always put in your CV, because this basically builds your expertise. Like one kind of expertise is, okay, you write papers, you get grants, and you publish papers. But another kind of expertise is that people ask for your opinion. And this is basically being part of a program committee, being part of a panel, for example, or being part of a grant panel. So all of this is very important for your CV, especially if you want to have kind of a academic/research career. Because if other people are listening to your opinion, then of course this matters in terms of career progression. And one thing that I mentioned here that I think should be also always mentioned again is that one reason to also be part of, or be a reviewer or be part of the program committee is that if you experience like how papers are reviewed, or you know how papers are reviewed, what the reviewers look for is very powerful knowledge to write your own papers. So for example, when I'm writing papers with more junior collaborators, I tell them, okay, maybe we should write this in this way, or maybe we should have this experiment, because I know that the reviewers at this conference or another workshop will look for this. So this is also a very good way to write better papers, that you see, for example, what kind of papers other people write, what kind of mistakes other people make, and also how they're fixed. Because also during the review process, you can also see the reviews from other reviewers. And then you can see, okay, maybe my review matches the review, maybe it's different, maybe it doesn't match, like you have very different, very opposite opinions and so on. So all of this is very valuable experience, and you should definitely include it in your CV. So in my CV, for example, I think I have half a page on all the program committees and workshops and journals I've been reviewing for. And this also shows that you are well connected to the community, like to different conferences and to different journals and workshops.
Yeah, one thing in addition to that is that actually in the US, when one apply for a particular visa tracks, in particular the O1, I mean the one that is for highly talented, highly rewarded talent. One of the things that they consider in the application is if you have been called to judge research in your area. So being a reviewer actually is a way to prove, to prove or to tick that box. So participating early on being a reviewer, it will strengthen your application. For example, for visas. So yeah, that's another of the benefits to keep in mind, especially like for those who are considering to apply for visas in the US. And I mean, most of us are from the Latin community. Some of the participants are from other countries, but this will help you. So
yeah, that's also a good point. Yes. Yeah, and also if you apply to any kind of like after your PhD, if you apply to professorships or like high level research positions, they also consider your reviewing experience as a positive thing, especially for professorships. Like if you find a professional candidate that doesn't have reviewing experience, that seems very strange, and it's very unlikely that will take you as a professor. Because the same thing is that if you're called to judge research, then of course that means you're a good researcher, and the university or the institution will have this expertise on their own rank. Because what also happens is that in large research groups and large like top universities, there's also a lot of internal peer review. Like for example, where I work, we also have some internal peer review for all the papers that go out as a way to strengthen the papers. So of course, for that you need to have like leaders in the field and people that are commonly part of program committees, both in conferences and workshops. So that's also very important for your future if you want to pursue more of a research career. So yeah, I think if there are no more questions, then we can end. And then of course, wait for an email from us about connecting you with your senior reviewer.
Well, thank you again, Matias and Victor and everyone who attended. This was a very enlightening and in-depth presentation that you put together for our members and particularly for the junior reviewers that will be taking part in our workshops that are upcoming for this year. So a quick round of applause for you. For all the effort that you've put in and for making yourself available to share your background and experience with our community. Yeah, if you haven't already, those who are participating in our program committee, if you are a junior reviewer and you would also like to receive mentoring from our larger mentoring program that we're offering, the applications are still open for our full research mentoring program. So if there's particular research that you have in mind that you would like to receive guidance on, please do not hesitate to fill out an application that's available on our website at latinxai.org/mentoring program. You can find it also /mentee application for our organization. It is free for you to participate, and the mentors that are involved are members from academia, from industry, from large corporations that we work with, as well as smaller startups and research institutions all over the world. So again, this would be a great way for you to get involved and to build on your skills and receive new opportunities as well within the industry to further your career. So thank you everyone again for joining us, and have a good rest of your week.